What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video I'm going to be going over the breakdown of the most recent Yata format tournament, which was held on Format Library and wrapped up just the other day. If you missed the final stream and the semifinal stream, they were both great games, and so you should check them out because they were some great top-level Yata format gameplay. But now that the tournament's wrapped up, we've got a metagame to break down, and I think that this tournament was really, really big in sort of introducing new deck ideas and showing where the meta will shift into the future. So I'm excited to dive into it with y'all. Before I do, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, definitely subscribe. We recently hit over 1,000 subs, and so I'll be having subscriber specials coming out later this week and also later in the month. So, if you want to be a part of reaching the next sub goals, like 1,100, 1,200, etc., then definitely subscribe and, enjoy the great gameplay videos that I put out, as well as these metagame breakdowns. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like down below, and also let me know in the comments what you think about how you see the format of Yata shaping up in the future. But with all that out of the way, let's dive into this tournament. So in terms of the deck type representation, there were 24 people total. And you'll note that, there wasn't any one deck that took over like half the playing field. Now, the most popular deck by far was known as quote-unquote hand control, which had 11 people playing it. But I said quote-unquote because I do think that hand control is a pretty nebulous sort of distinction. Hand control has typically just gone towards good stuff decks in the past. And I feel like, there's still that element of it. And some of the hand control decks that were classified as that may not be super heavy on ripping apart your opponent's hand. It might just be playing a copy of Don Zalug, and that's good enough for the categorization to count as hand control. And I know that different people sort of debate that sort of label. So instead of calling this hand control, I'll just call it sort of good stuff.deck. And this is just playing all the good cards in the format, basically, just the individually good ones that don't really rely on any other combos or anything like that. And so 11 people brought that, which makes sense given that it's a very popular, very standard type of deck. But as you'll see, that deck did not actually end up winning the tournament. So I'm very excited to cover what actually did. But I think another really important thing to note here is Gearfried. Gearfried was the second highest deck representation here at 5 players. And, I'll get into sort of top cut conversions later because 5 may not seem like that big of a deal. But 3 of those 5 players actually made it into top 8, which shows that Gearfried still definitely has a very threatening place in Yata and is still potentially a tier 1 deck. Moving on, we've got Gravekeepers, which had 2 people playing it. But again, as I mentioned with Gearfried, Gravekeepers did have, a top cut finish. One of those Gravekeepers players did make it into top cut. And so I think Gravekeepers is still also an extremely good deck. And Gearfried and Gravekeepers have won tournaments in the past, so I still think they're very, very formidable. We also had 2 players on Goat Control, and one of those did actually make it into the top cut as well. So as you can see, before even diving into the top cut decks, this top cut was very, very diverse. A lot of very different decks represented, and I think that's really, really cool in looking at the format going forward, because I do think that Yata is very, very underexplored. There's a lot of decks that can potentially top, and there's a lot of room for actually hammering out what the best of those are. So if you like, playing the DM era style format, but, you feel like Goat is maybe a little bit too solved, then Yata is definitely a place for you. Moving on from the decks that had more than one player playing them, we did have some one-off decks. We had a Fiend deck, we had a Germ Burn deck, a Machine OTK deck, and a Recruiter Control deck. And one of those decks actually did manage to win the tournament. So, if you haven't seen the finals, I'll leave you in suspense with that as we dive into the top cut decks themselves. I will also mention the deck category representation. I generally don't like this metric as much because I feel like even within the general categories, different decks can vary a lot in playstyle. But you do see here that, most decks were control-based, and I do think that that is a somewhat accurate representation in this format, that there generally is a lot of control strategies. So if you like control games, then Yata format is a very, very good format for you. But now let's dive into the top cut decks. So as I mentioned, Gearfried did manage to take 3 of the top 8 slots, although neither of these actually made it to the semifinals. They all sort of, scrubbed out in just the, I don't know what you'd call it, quarterfinals? Is that what you'd call it? But, basically, you've got the initial round of top 8, then the semifinals, then the finals. Gearfried didn't make it past the initial cut of that, but I do think the fact that it made it to top cut in such a high number is a very promising sign for the deck, and it's easy to see why. The Gearfried decks basically take advantage of Gearfried being a big body on field, easily searchable off of reinforced from the army, that also can pair with Blast with Chain to act as a pop, because Gearfried will destroy any card equipped to it, and Blast with Chain, when it's destroyed by a card effect while equipped to a monster, will get you pop on the field. Blast with Chain can also pair well with certain spell and trap removals, and make your opponent less likely to fire like a Harpy's Feather Duster or an MST blindly. I think this deck is really, really cool, and also being able to use Reinforced from the Army gives it more of a toolboxy sense, as you can also play Exiled Forest, Dawn Zalug, and Zempire of the Dark as well, and slot it into that package very, very nicely. I do also want to note, so this was Dump Truck's list here, and I do think that there are some interesting things in this deck, is playing a Ceasefire, which normally sees play in the side deck to go after more flip-focused strategies, but this can deal a bit of extra burn in a lot of situations, which can come up. Gearfried is a big monster, and when you're playing big monsters like this, you're potentially getting in a ton of damage, and if you're getting in a ton of damage, having that bit of burn at the end of the game can be pretty nice. This will also stop things that can give Gearfried trouble, like, Gravekeeper's Spy. Very annoying card to deal with if it gets out another Spy on field. You do have Zempire of the Dark in the deck, in some builds, so that can get over one of them, but you sometimes have trouble getting over another. So if you play Ceasefire, you both know about the Gravekeeper's Spy, and also can sort of plan around that. The deck is also playing a tribute monster in the form of Jinzo, so, you get to shut down your opponent's traps. This does shut down your Blast with Chains as well, but I do think Jinzo is a good enough OTK enabler that it's, sort of a good spot in this deck. And also, I want to point out that the deck is playing Yata. We saw in the last Yata tournament that some of the topping decks weren't playing Yata. This deck chose to. And, as we saw in the semifinal stream and the final stream, I believe, Yata format, it's named Yata for a reason, and Yata-Grasu can end up Yata locking your opponent in a lot of situations. So maybe not a must include in the main deck, but it is definitely a card that a lot of decks can use pretty well. So that was Dump Truck's build of the deck. Let's dive in to Ghost of 41st Pass build of the deck. And the interesting thing I want to note here is the increase in number of Gemini Elves, the increase in the number of Dawn Zalugs, and the increase in the number of Spirit Reapers. I think this is a very, very interesting choice. Things like Sangan, Sinister Serpent, and Yata have been cut from the main, as well as Fiber Jar, which is a really, really powerful card in this format. But it seems like Ghost of 41st Pass is mainly going for aggression, and, it paid off for them. They made it to the top 8. And as I mentioned in covering Dump Truck's version, this deck can get extremely aggressive, so it makes sense that you're going for this level of aggression. Ghost is also playing a Nobleman of Crossa in the main, and that's very good against like Gravekeeper's Spy. As I mentioned, Gravekeeper's Spy can be very annoying for this deck to deal with. So very interesting build here from Ghost, and the last build that we've got is from GMYFS, and it is like also just, sort of going the more aggressive route with the triple Gemini Elves here. But it's also playing triple Dust Tornado in the main, just allowing you to clear away your opponent's back row, make sure that your aggressive plays go through. And I think that that is also a very, very interesting sort of thing to prioritize in this deck. And I think these three builds show that you can sort of prioritize different aspects of the Gearfried deck to sort of, play it in slightly different ways. And I'm very curious to see, as this deck develops in the future, will the more aggressive approach that Ghost and GMYFS took, will that sort of bear out? Or will Dump Truck's more standard approach work out there? And I think time will tell. I think it's really, really exciting. If you are a Gearfried fan, then now is the time to jump in and explore this deck in depth. But moving on from the Gearfried decks, the other deck that sort of took honorary 5th place, because all these decks were sort of tied after that round, is Gravekeepers, and this was piloted by Spirit Reaper here. And this is a very, very sick deck. We saw the winner of the last tournament, Alafia 2, pilot this to a first place finish. And this is just awesome. Gravekeeper's Spy, very threatening card in this format. You can also bring out like Gravekeeper's Spirit Soldier, which can attack into things like Spirit Reaper and be very annoying for that. Assailant can also be a very, very good sort of beater. If Necro Valley's on the field is 2k, that can also switch the battle position of a face-up monster on your opponent's side of the field, which can be very nice if your opponent has like Gravekeeper's Spies of their own, as Gravekeeper's Spy is a card that's gotten a lot more popular in this format over time. Of course, the 2 Necro Valley, 1 Terraforming is being played. Necro Valley buffing up your monsters is very, very good. No Rite of Spirit being played. I think that Rite of Spirit is potentially a card to experiment with in Gravekeepers. But I guess, tournament results aren't bearing that out necessarily, although only 2 Gravekeeper players were in this tournament. So maybe that's a place to experiment with in the future. But I think this deck is really, really sick. I think that, being able to make it to top cut again shows that this was not just a one-off fluke of the last tournament. This deck does have some very threatening potential in this format. And so I'm very excited to see how people experiment and innovate with this deck going forward, as this really is sort of the first meta archetype in the game's history. So very, very cool to see. A lot of people really have the idea of archetypes really popping off, in 5Ds or GX. But this shows that in the DM era, they can potentially take names depending on the format. So moving on from the 5th place finishers, let's talk about the people who made it to semifinals. And the first list that I want to talk about there is Yammerman's GOAT Control list here. Now, it's called GOAT Control. I talked to Yammerman after the semifinals wrapped up. They said that, they might cut Scapegoat in the future. They felt it was a bit slow. I also brought a GOAT Control list to this tournament because, in the locals that we held beforehand, GOAT Control deck did make it to the top. So I figured, I'd test my hand out at it. And I also had the same sort of complaint. The goats felt like really slow. Thousand Eyes Restrict felt like not the best fusion monster to go into off of meta. So I do think that something like the light meta deck that I featured on my channel in the past would be potentially good to play, because you bring out level 6, you can get out like Ryu Senshi. If you're playing like Air Knight Parshath, potentially you can bring out like Dark Balter, you can bring out Fiend Skull Dragon. But there still is a lot to experiment with here. Like Lesser Fiend is another potential good option to play with this. You could play a Reasoning meta deck if you want. Playing Reasoning, get out big tributes to tribute off for other fusions. So there's a lot to experiment with here. I think the fact that, this deck made it to a 3rd place finish in this tournament, and also the fact that a deck like this won the locals that we held right before this tournament happened, shows that this deck does have some promise, at least as a tier 2 or above option. And so I am sure that if people experiment with the meta strategy more and sort of really hammer it out, it could definitely become a mainstay of top cuts in the future of this format. But beyond the sort of meta package here going into your fusion deck, you also have the powerful Dark Ruler Hades here as an option. Now, there are many ways to get this out on the field. You can see that Galmerman here is playing Gravekeepers Spies. That gets out bodies on board to tribute out for Hades or Jinzo. You can also play like Tomato and do it that way, although they're only playing 1 Tomato, and honestly, I respect that choice, just having the 1 Tomato go into a Sangam Witch or a Spirit Reaper. Also doesn't fill up the deck space as much. You'll also note that this deck has triple Magician of Faith, a level 1 that you can go into Restrict with, and also get back your powerful spells, of which this deck is playing a lot of them. It's also playing 2 creature swaps to pair with the Scapegoat, the Faiths, etc. So, very, very sick deck. I think that this does show that this deck has potential in the future, and I'm very excited to see how people continue to innovate with this thing going forward. And also, as a note, I just want to say that Government also mentioned that, if they made this deck again in the future, they would actually include Imperial Order and Fiber Jar, because they forgot to put those in the initial building. But I think the fact that this deck made it this far without those cards just shows the power of it. So I'm very excited to see how people continue to experiment with this in the future. But now that we've covered a bit more of these spicy takes, of course, Good Stuff.deck did make it into the top cut as well. And the first of those sort of Good Stuff.deck lists was piloted by Danny Droid, who, just like Gallerman, made it to semifinals, didn't quite make it to finals, but this deck is very, very sick. You'll note that they're playing the main deck King Tiger Wanghu. Very, very interesting inclusion, but it is good into something like Spy potentially, cuts them off of another Spy. Also very, very good against Tomato, although Tomato can search out like a Witch or a Sangan to get you a search off that. So, Wanghu's kind of an interesting card this format. It's not like super, super profitable, but it can be pretty good, especially like cutting off your opponent's tomatoes and stuff like that. So very cool to see this deck make it to the top cut here. And, as I said, this is kind of like just a Good Stuff.deck, but the Wanghus make it a little bit spicy. There is the main deck Knock as well, because, Gravekeeper Spy is becoming more popular. This deck also is not maining Gravekeeper Spy, so that's kind of interesting as well. But yeah, very, very solid deck, very sick deck. And, if you want just a Good Stuff.deck to play, then this is potentially a good option for you, just if you're starting out in the format. Of course, this wasn't the only Good Stuff.deck that made it into the top cut. The second place deck in the tournament, piloted by Paolo NS, was also more of a Good Stuff deck. And in this deck, you can see echoes of Jazz's second place list in the last Yata format tournament. And, what I mean by that is you see the Newdoria here. That was a tech that Jazz used. And Newdoria off of Tomato is very, very cool, can pop an opponent's monster. And it's just cool having access to that. So cool to see that experimented with. No spies again in this good stuff list. So maybe the spies are better in other decks besides just like the good stuff deck. Unclear, but the fact that there are no spies here, I think, is somewhat telling. Also, a Yata in the main deck, which does differ from Jazz's previous second place list. But also something I want to mention here is this single copy of Raigeki Break. Very interesting card here. Not really like main decked in a lot of cases, but I do think that this deck can support Raigeki Break, and having this pop can be very, very good. It sort of allows you to play on a similar axis to the Gear Feed list, although this deck is only playing one Raigeki Break, so maybe in the future people will try experimenting with more. But if you've got the Sinister Serpent in hand already, Raigeki Break is a really great pop, especially since people aren't really playing things like Kaiku, the Ghost Destroyer, or Book of Life. So you can be relatively assured that your Serpent will probably come back to hand. So I think this is really sick. Also, I want to point out the Premature Burial in the deck here. Premature Burial is an extremely powerful spell that isn't always played in these lists because it dies to things like MST, dies to Raigeki Break, and it dies to Imperial Order. So people haven't really played this all the time, but it is a very, very powerful card, and seeing it play in this list shows that maybe it does have some merit. So maybe people should get back on to experimenting with Premature Burial, slotting it into their decks. But, I've covered all the decks leading up to this. I think that I've shown how diverse this topic can be. But this is, nothing compared to the spicy list that actually managed to win the whole event. And of course, it was piloted by the Yata GOAT, Alafia2, who has won 3 Yata tournaments in the past, all playing off meta stuff. And they won with Germ Burn. Aggro Bomb, aggro burn, however you might want to put it. This deck is super, super sick, taking advantage of the burns cards like Giant Germ, which can also get you more bodies on board as well, and things like Nightmare Wheel, Magic Cylinder, Ceasefire, just so much cool burn technology in this deck. Also playing double Spear Dragon, Princess Tsurugi as well. Now, of course, in the final stream, we had an extensive chat with Alfie2 after they played this deck and won the tournament, and they said that in the future they'd probably cut the Princess Tsurugi and the Spear Dragons. Those were just a little bit cope. Didn't quite come up as much. Maybe replace the Spear Dragons with things like Gemini Elf potentially. And they also said that they might potentially cut the Morphing Jar as well, as that was also a little bit slow and didn't really get them as much value as they potentially would have wished. But I think that, even with all these sorts of suboptimal cards in the deck, in Alfie2's opinion, this deck is super, super sick, and it's a really good starting place if you want to sort of experiment with this deck idea for yourself. And the fact that it was able to win, even with these cards that, Alfie2 didn't really like by the end of the tournament, shows the power of this deck. Ramming Germ into your opponent's monsters to deal a ton of damage, and pairing that with things like Nightmare Wheel, Ceasefire, etc. can be very powerful. Also, this deck is really, really good with Fiber Jar, because Fiber Jar resets the game state, but it doesn't reset the life points. So if you're getting in a ton of burn on your opponent, and then you have this Fiber Jar to reset the board state, reset your burn options, and deal more damage to them later, that can be very, very powerful. So a very, very cool list. Also, the double creature swap here, potentially give your opponent a Giant Germ, or like a flipped up Princess Tsurugi or something like that. So cool inclusion there, and can enable you to get in even more damage as well. This deck is just super, super sick. And I haven't talked about the side deck much for these lists. And I'm probably not going to do it here either, as I think the side deck is relatively straightforward. You got the Just Desserts for more burn, you got the Torrential Tributes against more aggressive decks, Scapegoat also as a defensive option against more aggressive decks, Jinzo for trap focused decks. There's double spy in the side, and Alfie2 I think said that they brought in these spies a lot. So spy maybe is an option to consider for this deck in the future, as attacking into a 2k defender does deal some chip damage and can help out with your Ceasefire count. But, again, pretty standard side deck here. You'll note that Delinquent Duo is in the side as opposed to the main deck. And I think this is something that I've seen in a variety of Yata decks, as Duo isn't necessarily as strong a hand rip as something like Comfy or Force Sentry. It does cost you 1,000 as well. And so I'm curious to see how people will sort of navigate Delinquent Duo in the future. There's just so much to consider for the future of Yata format, the future of this meta. I think that there's just so much to explore, so much to optimize, and I'm really excited to see people do it. It's just like every single thing you see in these topping lists just raises more questions for the future, raises questions about what version of these decks is best, what the top decks of the format are, because I really feel like that is unknown at this point. You know, we've seen topping lists. We've seen a lot of different topping lists. We've seen a hand control list. We've seen Gear Freed. We've seen Gravekeepers. We've seen this sort of new Germ Burn, Aggro Burn deck. The future is bright for this format. There's just so much to explore, and it makes me really, really excited to see this format getting more popularity. And so I hope that, you know, we continue to see this innovation in the format. People continue to try it out. And I'm really looking forward to the next Yata format tournament as well. But what do you all think of this analysis? Do you think that, you know, these decks only really got to the top based on skill, and that it was too small of a tournament to really judge, you know, whether this has an impact on the metagame as a whole? Because 24 people, you know, not as big as something like a typical GOAT tournament or an Edison tournament. But I do think it is still a decent enough sample size to glean some insights here. But I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And I hope you enjoyed as always. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.